All right, we will go ahead and start our study of Hebrews chapter 9 and continue our work really through verses 18 through 20, where we're looking at kind of the last half of this paragraph here that begins in verse 15 and goes down through verse 22. And if you read this paragraph and you've looked at verses 1 through 14, you've seen that the author's main point up to this degree is that the old covenant is faulty. Moses cannot save you. The blood of animals cannot save you. Aaron's sacrifices cannot save you. Animal blood has no capacity to remove sin. And the question always comes up, then why? Why for 1,500 years would there be a system in which thousands, tons, millions, if not billions of animals are sacrificed on a regular basis to appease the Mosaic law? And it really boils down to an act in which God takes sin so seriously, and blood is necessary to cleanse sin, that creating a 1,500-year long type of Christ that is to come is necessary to get the point across. And so we see that kind of displayed here in verses 16 17, which we looked at last week, which is where there's this unusual description of a will. And we looked at this fact. This word here, this Greek word for will, is actually the word diatheke. It's the word for covenant. Everywhere else in Hebrews, it's the word for covenant. It's unusual that it's translated will here. And it's only translated will here in Scripture. Nowhere else in the Old New Testament will you find translated will. Normally that would be a red flag for contextualization. It would be a concern to say, well, they're translating it out of context here. This is not the word for will. This is the word for covenant, as it's used 99% of the time throughout the rest of the Bible. And that would be true, except for two things. One, the logic of the verse tells us the will must be established by a death. So if you're dealing with a covenant, and this really boils down to our interpretation of covenants in general, a covenant being a law. A covenant is when you write down a law, it's a contract, right? Even to this day, you refer sometimes to a covenant as a contract. You write a word down, it's written on paper, everyone reads it, everyone signs it, they understand precisely the term in every part of the contract. A covenant is the same. It is a legal, if you will, God divinely writing a legal contract with Moses and with the Israelites, saying, these are the rules by which you will abide, and if so, there will be these benefits. Now we get here to a will, and it's a covenant, some kind of legal documentation, some contract that's determined by death, specifically an established death, and it only takes effect after death. Based on this logic, we have to be talking about a will, even if that's an unusual interpretation for this word. So in other words, what I'm saying is we're using immediate context here instead of the typical definitions that you'd find in a Greek lexicon. And this matters because this makes this metaphorical. Okay? In other words, what I'm arguing and what I argued last week is where you see these two little verses that talk about a will, he is not saying this is how every covenant works. He's not saying this is how every single deal that God has made with anyone throughout history works. He is simply using a covenant here, kind of almost tongue-in-cheek, parabolically, metaphorically. It's an analogy he's using here. He's using a metaphor to describe the nature of how Christ benefits you. Christ is like a will. When he dies, you get benefits. At the point in which something is promised to you in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, through Isaiah, through Jeremiah, it is promised that God will send a Messiah who will forgive and remove sins, right? That is absolute. You can find that written in Isaiah 53. And then Christ comes and he dies, and after his death, you receive benefits. In other words, the author is saying his covenant is like a will. It must be perpetuated based on blood. And so that is the idea of this covenant, that even the covenant itself can be described like a salvation is in effect a will. Christ died, and now you are the beneficiator of it. So we're grateful, and really, ultimately, this should boil down to, remember, this whole idea, the entire purpose so far of the author has been to convince these Hebrews of the necessity of Christ over Moses. The whole point of the book of Hebrews is do not return back to Moses. Moses can't save you. Don't become a practicing Orthodox Jew in the sense that you're going to reject Christianity again and fall back into old ways. You should never do that because Christ is like a will. You benefit because of his death. And now this week, we're looking at the next point. So if you want to make the first point about this argument, how can we make the point in verse 15 that he's the mediator of a new covenant? Point number one, his death is like a will that brings about benefits for you. That's how he's the mediator of a new covenant. Second point, a covenant requires blood. That's what we're looking at today. And it even explains it. And every commandment of the law has been declared by Moses to all the people. He took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant God commanded for you." Okay, so we could say this is point number two. If Christ's death is like a will that brings you benefits and that makes him a mediator, then the second thing that makes him a mediator is that his blood inaugurates or ushers in a covenant of sorts, because even the old one had to be enacted based on blood. So I'm going to translate verses 18 and 19 here today. We'll look at these and we will derive a translation or an interpretation, excuse me. So this is a very short one. You see verse 18 is very small. You have, let me move this out of the way. Othen hude he prote. So this is when, or for when, I should say. For when. This is kind of like just a prepositional interrogative word. It just means to set something in a certain place and time. Hude. Not, or not even, or not about. Who is OU is no. De is like but or however, something like that. So however not or but not. Hey prote, the first. Protos is first, right? Protes is first. Choris, without. Hematos, excuse me. Blood. Think of a hemiologist or the study of hematology, the study of blood. Hema is blood. Eg kakain istai. Eg kakain istai. This is a big old verb right here. This translates out to begin, to inaugurate, to bring about, to start. Something along those lines. Something cannot begin or be inaugurated in some way. So, now you can probably see, and in most of your English translations, is supplied right here for context, the word covenant, right? That's not there in the original text. It's a pretty safe bet, though, because no matter what, you're looking at the first, something that is first had to be inaugurated with blood. Just got done talking about a will and the death of someone who inaugurates a will. And then in verse 19, which we're about to look at, you see the description where he actually makes the will clear, right? At something he's talking about is the covenant, the old covenant, the covenant of Moses is a description here. The first covenant could not come about unless there was blood. Okay? Now, this is interesting. Now, note that the fact that the author makes clear he didn't say death. Death is verses 16 and 17. You have to have death to have a will. But here he changed the word. You have to have blood to have a covenant. And you could say, well, blood comes about from death. Absolutely it does, for sure. Your blood does not get spilled unless there is death, but he chose to use blood instead of death to describe something specific. When blood is spilled, you do not have a peaceful death. Blood, by very definition, should not be spilled in a peaceful death situation, right? There are many people who die without not spilling a drop of their blood. When blood is shed, someone is either cut or destroyed. Now, the only word that I want to highlight here of significance that's worth or interpretive, and the only key word I would really highlight is this one, to inaugurate, to begin something. And this is a time word. This is a word that describes a certain place and fixed time that the first covenant began. And it's an unusual word because it's really only found here and in two other places. You can find this word to inaugurate something, which is interesting because there are a lot of Greek words to begin, to start up something. But this word is only used twice, and it's used once in Hebrews chapter 10, which you can look at just a page over, and in John chapter 10 to describe the feast of inauguration or dedication or the beginning of something. And if you go look at John chapter 10, this is Jesus going up to the Feast of Booths, and they're beginning the feast. The feast is being kicked off. It's a week-long event, and it's being begun in Jerusalem, and he goes and visits there at a certain point in time. So this is kind of like a ceremonial beginning. You use this word, in other words, to describe a ritual, a ceremony. Something's beginning. Something's being kicked off in some way. Something that is going to stand for some time is going to come about. You can also see it in Hebrews chapter 10. The new and living way that he opened through the curtain, that is through his flesh. If you go look at Hebrews chapter 10, the curtain is the temple, right? If you remember, at the point when Jesus died, the curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. That barrier that's supposed to be between you and God is ripped. We're dealing with a ceremonial beginning of some sort when we talk about inaugurating something. Now, before I go too much further, I do want to look at verse 19. I'm going to go ahead and translate them both up front, and then we're going to look at what comes about through them. So, this is the long one. Lelesteas, excuse me, Lelesteas. This is for it is said, or it was said. Excuse me, this would be past tense. And you have your post-positive right here, gar, G-A-R, gamma, alpha, rho, for. In English, we'd put this in the front. For it was said, passes antoles, all teachings or commands. We'll use the word commands. It could be a teaching, it could be a command. This both are plural. For all commands, kata tan nama, of the law. Of the law. Hupa, you've got a capital M there, capital mu in Greek. Museos. Who do you think Museos is? Yep, under Moses. That is the Greek rendering of the Hebrew word for Moses. Ponti to leao. To all the people. For it said, all the commands of the law under Moses to the people. Once the commands were given under Moses to the people. Labon tahema. He took the, what is hema? We just looked at this. Blood. He took the blood. Hema is blood. Tone maskon. This is the this is the lesser known word. Maskon is a cow or a bull. Actually, it's technically a male, so it'd be a bull. Meta hudatas with hudatas of a hydro. This is the word where in Latin we get our word hydro from this. This is water. Hudas is hydro, water. And kai eriu. And this is eriu being scarlet or red of some sort. I'm sorry, no, eriu is the wool or thread. And this does matter when we get down into the text because you're going to see wool and thread are interchangeable words in the Greek and Hebrew Testament. And you think, remember this because in this day and age, 99.9% of the standard cloth is wool. Everything is wool in this day and age. Wool is for thread and thread is for wool. They're interchangeable. The only purpose wool really has in this day and age is to be sewn and spun into thread and made into clothing. Only the very wealthy, the very rich have silks on a very, or those who are extremely well-to-do or those who spend a great deal of money have silk, and it certainly wasn't an everyday item. Typically you have wool, but this wool is kakinu. It's red. I think your text might say scarlet, a bright red, but this is red. It's red wool or thread. And hustopu. Hustopu. Any guesses as to this? Yes, husop. Bear in mind that in Greek there is no Y. They don't have a Y vowel like we do, so they use a U instead to describe a Y sound. So it would be usop in Greek, but in English we use a Y, hyssop. This is hyssop, the vegetable, the reed. On it, Auto is on it. This is just a personal pronoun. The, or to the, biblion. Biblion guesses us to biblion. Biblion. What's a biblion in Greek? A book. Bible is book in Greek. A Bible is a book. Biblion is a book of any kind. And panta, all things, ton leon, to the people, eron tisen. This is a little used verb. It's not used very commonly. It means to sprinkle or to rain in some way, to sprinkle or rain. So this is a big, long verse that has a lot of mechanical parts moving in it, very technical terms that are very precise. Hyssop is a very specific thing. A cow is a very specific thing. There's no great difficulty you're going to have in translating and interpreting these words, is my point. These are not words that are going to, they might define our interpretation, but they're not difficult words. We know exactly what this word means. We know exactly what hyssop is. We know exactly what red wool is. The key words, if we wanted to highlight them, would be sprinkling. What does that mean? That is sprinkled with blood. And the commands. What are all the commands? And well, as you've likely picked up, he's talking about a very specific event that's going to tell us everything we need to know about how to interpret this particular verse. This event, where would you think we would find a place where Moses sprinkles the people with blood? This is going to be Exodus. This is, as we looked at, remember, in verse 18, something began with blood. Something was started with blood. Moses only began one thing. He began a covenant, and he began a very specific covenant, and you can find it described in detail in Exodus 24. If you go look at Exodus 24, the way Exodus is laid out, the first 20 chapters, or really I should say 19 chapters, are the story, right? You see the plagues come about. You see Moses bring them through Egypt. They come through the Red Sea. They come through Sinai. He meets with Jethro. But the law is not dispensed until Exodus 20. That's the first appearance of the Ten Commandments you'll find in Exodus 20. And then he spends 3 chapters giving you some specifics of the law. These are absolutes of the law. However, in chapter 24 of Exodus, and there's a great deal of law that comes after this point, where you can read, you read Numbers, you read Deuteronomy, you see Leviticus especially, you see a great deal of details about the law. But in Exodus 24, there's a confirmation of the covenant that happens. And we can read this here. And then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship me from afar." Okay, this is the Lord. He's speaking to Moses. He's just given Moses the law. And he says, and Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. So Moses come and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. There's your entoles right there, teachings, commands. Moses literally, verbally relayed all the words and commands down to the people. This is a fascinating realization of ancient times. As a side note, I read a study recently that talked about verbal translation of knowledge, how so you can still go to some places in central India, in central China, and central Africa, and they don't write books. They have they do, but for the most part, a great deal of the transmission of knowledge is still verbal. They'll still pass down entire books, massive tomes of knowledge that they've memorized over and over and over again, simply because they don't have the access to writing. And ironically, and funny enough, as foreign as it is to American minds, it's still 99.9% accurate to those that care enough to maintain it. We have records where church fathers like Augustine or Athanasius memorized entire books of scripture word for word, like Isaiah or Jeremiah, massive, massive tomes. And here you see Moses. He can effectively memorize everything that the Lord has relayed to him on Mount Sinai and relate it all verbally to the same people verbatim. And then you see what happens. All the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words the Lord has spoken, we will do." And we know that's probably the biggest lie you can find in the Old Testament, but they do confirm the covenant. Right? They say, we will do these things, even if we give them benefit of the doubt and believe a lot of them in this generation might. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen. There's your bulls or your cows to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar. Okay? He sprinkled the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Okay, you got a second confirmation, this time not from the elders, from the whole congregation. And we will be obedient. Then Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance to these words, which is verse 20 of Hebrews chapter 9, right? The blood of the covenant. We're going to look at that next week. But for our purposes, here we have the event. The same thing that he's talking about here in Hebrews 9:19 is this event right here, described in Exodus. This is a confirmation of covenant. And this covenant has been told to them. They've relayed the covenant. Moses explained every rule, all the covenants, all the commands have been relayed to these people. And then they accept and they are obedient and they say, yes, this is how we will adopt the covenant. And they do that twice, right? Not just the elders, but every person in the congregation. And then, and only then, does he sprinkle blood on the people. Okay? And he sprinkles the altar. I know the text in Hebrews says book. Here it says altar. And the difference we'll get to here in just a minute. We might split some hairs over that here in just a second. But either way, there's this kind of shedding of blood of these oxen, right, that are the peace offerings. Bear this in mind. The blood came from these bulls. These bulls were the peace offering to the Lord. That's significant. Blood is shed in peace offerings. Now remember, we've looked at this previously in earlier in Hebrews chapter 9. When you kill an animal in the Mosaic Law, 95% of the time, it's not just a good... You could offer goodwill offerings to the Lord. You could give him grain. You could give him oil. You could give him the first fruits of your harvest, things that aren't blood. But blood, animals are killed to remove sin. Something has to die when you are wrong. And here is a peace offering. You have to make peace with the Lord by killing oxen. And then that blood is taken. And Moses says, here is the confirmation. And he throws it on the altar and he throws it on the people after they confirm the covenant. Now, there's a lot of things that are happening here. One commentator looks at it this way. He says the expression blood of the covenant it is true a marked one, denoting the ideally symbolical exchange of blood as a foundation for blood relationship. But no human blood is here used, and still less can there be any thought of real blood of God, although as sacrificial blood it comes from God, and so forth is a typical mystery, and is sprinkled upon men, symbolically expiating them and devoting them to sanctification. So this is Lang. He uses this... basically the statement of blood of the covenant to say it's a sealing device. You throw the blood on the altar. It says God will uphold his will. Here's the altar. I've sprinkled blood on it. You can go look at the blood right now and see that God confirms this covenant with you. And then you can go look at the people and say, look, they're covered in blood, the same blood, the exact blood that's thrown on the altar that confirms that they agreed to the covenant. Right? It's a sealing device. You think of medieval times or even up into Renaissance and colonial periods when men would stamp letters with rings, with wax, and you would seal it. And your signia would be on the ring that you use to stamp it. This is the seal that you know this is my word and I wrote these words and there's no way anyone can argue that I didn't write these words because my ring is on this piece of paper. The blood is a sealing device that seals the covenant. Here's the proof that it is legitimate, it is validated by all parties, and it is in effect. Now we know blood. Why blood, though? Because that's the real take, isn't it? Verse 18 says it's valid. The covenant's not just validated from death or from sealing. It's validated by blood. Because blood is something else significant. Blood is sacrificed for peace offerings. When you spill blood, it's because someone at some point sinned and was evil and has to be forgiven. And God cannot forgive without the blood. And we know this, and we're going to look at this in verse 22, right? Without blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. This is a significant point that's worth taking the time to make. An argument could be made, why do the other covenants not require blood? Noah's covenant didn't require blood. God just made a covenant. He gave him a rainbow. That's the covenant. The Abrahamic covenant didn't really require blood. It was officiated by blood. There were certainly sacrifices Abraham made when he sacrificed animals to praise the Lord or worship the Lord after the covenant had been made, but they weren't required to seal the covenant. David, right? David's covenant on the throne of David will send one of David's descendants forever. Doesn't require sacrifice. Why is it that, and we know this to be true, and this is also part of verse 18. This is not the first covenant, right? God has made smaller covenants with Abraham, with Noah, before he even got to Moses. So why is this called the first? Because this is the first blood covenant. And other covenants do not require blood unless they are dealing with sin. The covenant of Noah, the covenant of David are not covenants that mandate sacrifice, because when you kill something, someone is either being punished or destroyed, righteously so. When God has to have a relationship with human beings, blood has to be spilt, and blood implies destruction, right? You don't die peacefully in your sleep. Something was slit open. Something was butchered to make this possible. This is violence. Only the Mosaic and the Abrahamic, you can make an argument for the Abrahamic covenant, that even if it wasn't part of the requirements of the covenant, that Abraham sealed it with blood. But either way, all those covenants deal with sin. These are covenants that are different from Davidic covenants or from Noah's covenant, because these are covenants about how God is going to address you if you're a sinner. David doesn't do that. Noah doesn't do that. Covenants that deal with sin require blood, right? If you're going to have a right relationship with God, you have to have something or someone die, if it's you or something else. Blood is a method of punishment. That's the idea. Sin, by definition of a righteous God, requires punishment. If God is holy, if God is good, if God is righteous, then by very definition, something has to die to make it possible. That's the idea. So, any covenant dealing with sin where God is going to have a relationship with sinful man has to enforce death and punishment on some level. And we see that A.W. Pink illustrates this through he talks about the justice of God. This, I don't believe, is actually in the attributes of God. It's a separate book that he wrote aside from the attributes of God, but I might be mistaken into that. But he writes about the justice of God, saying, in human affairs, justice is simply the giving to everyone his due. That's how human justice works. You take my eye, I take yours. But such a rule cannot possibly be applied to the Most High God, for the simple reason that he owes his creatures nothing. It cannot be too strongly insisted upon in this day of fleshly arrogance and spiritual ignorance that there is a vast difference between God's government over his rational creatures and that of an earthly prince over his subjects, and that consequently our notion of justice with regard to the latter cannot be lawfully applied to the former. And he does make a good point. Justice between men is a very different affair than justice with God. It is a failure at this very point which has resulted in the most wild and irreverent postulates in connection with the justice of God, whereby he has been brought down to the level of his creatures. Then he gives you his definition. His definition actually starts right here. Absolutely considered, there's a way to write your definition. God's justice is the universal rectitude of his nature, for antecedent to all the acts of his will respecting the government of his creatures. The glorious and incomprehensible God was essentially and intrinsically righteous in himself. That's big theological jargon to say the justice of God is the fact that in all dealings with men, he is right. In every single human being on this planet, he will deal with. And he will deal with them rightly and justly, whether that's through Christ or whether that's through themselves. They will all receive, to a degree, justice. Now, we know as Christians and as believers in Christ, our justice has been already paid for, but still justice was dispensed. He has what A.W. Pink says, the universal rectitude. Everything must be righted. God must right Everything will be right by God. Anything that God deals with or touches must be made right. And so if you're a sinner, if you are someone who is not good and not holy, at some point he will right you, whether that's through Christ or through hell. And so that's exactly what we're looking at with the covenants of blood. And there's only two, maybe an argument for three: Abraham, Moses, and Christ, right? And then we're going to look at in coming verses how even the one of Moses doesn't write anything. So the first covenant is inaugurated with blood. It stands as a symbol. When you build something, a covenant with blood, it has a seriousness to it. That means something died to seal it and make clear the nature of it. It is absolute in that regard. And furthermore, this has to be done with some level of inauguration, as verse 18 makes clear. When God works in space-time, right, he exists outside of space and time, but he works within human beings' ability of space and time. He begins at some point to deal with creatures that began. And in this case, he sets in place a ceremonial kind of sealing of the seriousness of this covenant. This is how sins will be addressed in Moses' time. So the bottom line is God demonstrates the serious justice of his covenant with blood. He does that with Christ. He does that with Moses. Blood is the power of life, which means when God kills something to make it so, you know that it involved justice. And both Moses and Christ deal with justice. And that, between God and man, not between human beings. Now, I want to stop for a second and do a couple little text critical things as quickly as I can. Because you say, wait a minute, Alex, there's a lot of other stuff happening in this verse, and there seems to be some inconsistencies. One of which is, I believe, in some study Bibles and modern translations, you'll probably see goats put there, or maybe you might have a footnote that says also goats is considered in this verse. In Hebrews 9:19, some study Bibles will say cows and goats, and you say, wait a minute, there ain't no goats dying in Exodus 24, and that's correct. The word goats is pretty questionable. I should have looked up a textual commentary for this, and I did not. I just looked at what variants were available, and it's pretty difficult to pin this one. It's about a 50-50 coin toss as to whether or not the word goats also appeared in the New Testament Hebrews chapter 9 text. Okay? The word goat, most of the very oldest versions do not have the word goat, but a lot of the very widespread versions almost unanimously have goat included in the text. So this is one of those cases where we do a little textual criticism, and I'm going to come down on the argument of, and I'll typically almost always do this, better safe than sorry. If you don't know if it's inspired or not, and you can't say for certain it's inspired or not, best to tread it lightly. So here's a case where we don't know if the word goats is actually in the original text, so I'm going to be safe rather than sorry and discard it. And if I pay the price for that on Judgment Day, I will do so. But now, if we don't know if it's inspired or not, and it seems also to coincide with the fact that in Exodus, only cows are mentioned as dying, oxen specifically. So it would make sense to assume that that goats was added later as a mistranslation. It's not in the original text. So I'm going to discard that. But you say, well, there's a bunch of other stuff that we got to deal with that coincides with 9:19. One is this scarlet wool and hyssop. You say, wait a minute, Alex. We go back up here to Exodus 24. There's mention of the blood. There's no mention of this scarlet wool and this hyssop or water or any of that stuff. The blood is certainly there, but not these other aspects of it. You say, well, how can the author of Hebrews 9:19 say that there's scarlet wool and hyssop there? Now, this gets a little more involved, and we have to make a couple implications culturally here. One is you have actually seen scarlet wool and hyssop very recently, and that was in Numbers 19. If you remember back up in verse 13 of Hebrews chapter 9, he talks about the ashes of a heifer, right? We looked at this extensively, how there's a special holy water that is set aside specifically for sprinkling on those who touch cadavers, on dead carcasses. They have to be sprinkled with this holy water after they touch dead matter. And the text actually states you throw scarlet wool and hyssop into the fire with the heifer, and the dung of the heifer, and that's how you create the water with the ash of this heifer, right? There's only a few mentions of scarlet wool and hyssop. You'll find hyssop all over the place by itself. Hyssop as its own shows up in Psalms, it shows up in Jeremiah, it shows up in Isaiah, but scarlet wool and hyssop combined together only show up in a few places. Scarlet wool shows up a number of places. Scarlet threads, scarlet wool, and it is used interchangeably with thread. You can find that all through Exodus, where they talk about the weaving of the garments of the priests and the tabernacles, and how the curtain had scarlet and purple threads in it. But to use these both together signifies something. It's only used here in Numbers 19, scarlet wool and hyssop, where you take cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet yarn and throw them in the fire. It's used amazingly in Leviticus 14. Go look at Leviticus 14. Scarlet wool lumped together with hyssop is also used of curing leprosy. There's only one other place it's mentioned besides this. So you see Leviticus 14, this is when the priest is effectively clearing somebody who claims they've been healed of leprosy. The priest kills 2 clean birds, and he takes cedar wood and yarn and hyssop, and he effectively proclaims the man clean with the water and the blood of the dove. So, fascinatingly enough, that's something you don't really see until the time of Christ, but it is something that shows up here. The only other place that you can really see, I've got some more written down from Leviticus 14. This is the law of the leprous person. In the case of the leprous disease is healed from the leprous person, you will be taken 2 birds and the cedar wood and yarn and hyssop. The priest shall command them to kill them. Shall take the bird and shall dip them in the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed, and he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who was cleansed of the disease. So what you're kind of looking at here is, I should have got a graphic up here, but it's basically a bundle. If you have the hyssop as a plant, you bundle it together with some scarlet wool, you wind it up, you dip it like a paintbrush in the blood. Okay, you take this hyssop, this vine, this growth, this plant, you use it effectively like your sprinkling device. You almost think of Eastern Orthodox incense containers, where they built a little container to disperse incense. Here you have hyssop, and you bind it together with scarlet wool, then you dip it in some red blood, and then you sprinkle something with it. Okay, that happens in Numbers 19, that happens in Leviticus 14, and it happens in Exodus 12. Exodus 12 is the Passover, the first Passover. This is where Moses tells them to cover their doorposts in blood. And you'll note they take hyssop and dip it in blood and then touch the lintel of the doorposts in blood. That is in the base. It's your paintbrush. You don't touch the blood with your hands. You dip hyssop in blood and then you paint with it. So the hyssop is an instrument of how you dispense this blood. And I am arguing that we'll use this commentator to use this. He inserts with water and wool, red, and hyssop, as these were associated in his mind with a general ritual of sprinkling, water, hyssop, and scarlet thread. For example, he remembered them from the description from another part of the ritual in Numbers 19. The water was used to dilute the blood. The stems of the small wall plant called hyssop were tied with scarlet wool to form a sprinkler, in the rite of cleansing a leper or for sprinkling blood. In other words, the author is saying that Moses, what's not stated in Exodus 24 is that Moses used the brush to sprinkle the people with. That's just simply not stated in Exodus 24, but this author either has divine foreknowledge that we don't know, is inspired by God in methods we don't know, to know that this is specifically the method how Moses did it. Moses, when he writes Exodus, doesn't really tell you the method and the instruments he uses to sprinkle with. This author does. This author takes the time to recall this particular device that was used to sprinkle the blood. So that's what I'm arguing for, the reason for you see these 2 descriptors here of the hyssop and the wool tied together to use as a brush for sprinkling the altar, to sprinkle the book, to sprinkle the people. And I'm going to go ahead and stop here because I want to do verses 20 through 22 as one unit, because you will see the quote and the reason for the quote that comes up there. So I'm going to go ahead and actually stop here for the night. and imply that the seriousness of the blood used for covenant implies the seriousness of the covenant, and God's justice requires blood, and that is demonstrated throughout ancient times. When you kill something and you dip a branch of hyssop tied up with wool in that blood, and you sprinkle or you paint with that blood, you are painting this, whatever you are sealing with the covenant gets painted with that brush. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here.